It started innocently enough, just a fleeting sense of unease that I shrugged off as stress or maybe too much caffeine. But as the nights went on, it became impossible to ignore. There was something in my room, something I couldn't explain, and it was getting closer. It wasn't just me, though. That was the most unsettling part. My sister Lisa was experiencing it too, and when we finally shared our stories, the terror we felt multiplied tenfold. My family moved into the old house when I was 13, right after Dad got a new job in a small town miles away from where we'd lived our whole lives. The house was nothing special, just your typical two-story with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. But it had character, and my parents seemed happy with it. Lisa and I even got to pick out our own rooms, which felt like a win. I chose the room at the end of the hall on the second floor. It was a little smaller than the others, but it had a huge window that let in a lot of natural light. I loved that room during the day, but at night it became something else entirely. The first time it happened, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I felt a weight on my chest, like something was pressing down on me. My eyes snapped open, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, pinned to the mattress, and all I could do was stare at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner of my room, just at the edge of the shadows where the light from the window didn't reach. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a pile of clothes or a shadow cast by the furniture. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a woman, tall, thin, with long, dark hair that hung in front of her face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move to get out of bed, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my own mind while this thing stared at me from the shadows. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually my body jerked violently and I was able to move again. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my heart racing. The woman was gone, the room empty, but the terror remained. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as just a nightmare, maybe a bout of sleep paralysis. I'd heard about it before, how your brain can wake up before your body does, causing you to feel trapped and hallucinate. It made sense, but it didn't explain how real it had felt, how vivid she had been. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even Lisa. She was younger than me, and I didn't want to scare her. Besides, it was probably just a one-time thing. That's what I kept telling myself anyway, but it wasn't. The next night, it happened again, and then the night after that. But every time, the same thing. The weight on my chest, the paralysis, the woman standing in the corner of my room. Each night, she seemed to get a little closer, inching forward with each passing second. I could never see her face. Her hair always obscured it, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and unblinking. By the end of the week, I was terrified to go to bed. I tried everything to stay awake, reading, playing video games, drinking coffee, but eventually exhaustion would win, and I'd drift off to sleep, only to wake up paralyzed with her watching me. One night, after another sleepless episode, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went downstairs to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would calm my nerves. As I passed Lisa's room, I noticed her light was still on. I knocked softly on the door, and when she answered, I could tell she'd been crying. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping into her room. Lisa hesitated, wiping her eyes. I didn't want to say anything because I thought you'd think I was crazy. "What is it?" I pressed, suddenly worried. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "Have you seen anything weird in your room at night?" My heart skipped a beat. Like what? Lisa looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. Like a woman, standing in the corner, just watching you. I felt a chill run down my spine. "You've seen her too?" Lisa nodded, her voice trembling. "Every night she gets closer. I can't move, I can't scream, I just lie there, watching her watch me." We sat in silence for a moment, the reality of our shared nightmare sinking in. It was one thing to experience something like this alone, to write it off as a bad dream or sleep paralysis. But for both of us to see the same thing, that was something else entirely. We decided to switch rooms that night, hoping it would break whatever cycle we were stuck in. But it didn't help. Lisa saw the woman in my room, and I saw her in hers. The terror followed us no matter where we went. We finally told our parents, but they brushed it off as just overactive imaginations. "It's a new house," Mom said, "and you're both still adjusting. It's probably just stress from the move." But we knew it was more than that. We could feel it. We tried everything. Sleeping with the lights on, leaving the TV on all night, even praying. But nothing worked. The woman kept coming back, night after night, getting closer and closer. Finally, we convinced our parents to let us switch rooms with them, hoping that maybe the master bedroom would be safer. But the first night we spent in their room, I woke up to find the woman standing at the foot of the bed, closer than she'd ever been before. Her hair was still hanging in front of her face, but I could see her lips moving, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. The next day, we decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed up our things and moved into a rental while we looked for a new place. My parents still didn't believe us, but they were willing to do anything to help us feel safe again. For a while, things were better. The nightmares stopped and we started to feel like ourselves again. But a few months later, when we finally moved into our new house, the terror came back. I woke up in the middle of the night, the familiar weight pressing down on my chest. My heart raced as I looked around the room, praying she wouldn't be there. But she was, standing in the corner just like before, her dark figure blending into the shadows. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, she leaned in closer, her form hovering just inches from my face. I could feel her breath on my skin, cold, like the chill of a winter's night. It smelled of decay, of something long dead and forgotten. Then she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Leave," she hissed, her words sending a jolt of terror through me. "Leave this place, you do not belong here." The breath on my face grew colder, sharper, like icy needles pricking my skin. Her voice, though soft, was laced with a venomous warning, and I felt her words deep in my bones. I wanted to move, to obey, but I was still frozen, trapped in my own body. The woman's breath grew harsher, more insistent, as if she were trying to force her command into my mind. My vision blurred, my head spinning with fear and desperation. The woman's whisper intensified, becoming more urgent, more threatening. "Leave, or you will regret it." Finally, with every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move. My fingers twitched, my body jerking as I fought against the paralysis. The woman's breath was in my ear now, her voice a relentless hiss, repeating the same words over and over. "Leave, leave, leave." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis broke. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The room was empty, the shadow woman gone, but the cold still lingered. Lisa had the same experience that night. We knew then that she wouldn't leave us alone while we were in that house. The shadow woman's warning was clear, and I'd be a fool to ignore it. Whatever she was, whatever she wanted, I'm not about to tempt fate. We moved far away from that house, but the memories linger, haunting us in the dead of night. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see the shadow woman standing at the foot of my bed. I listen for the whisper, for the cold breath on my skin, but the room is always silent. Still, I can't shake the feeling that she's watching. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never go back to that house, because the next time, I might not be so lucky. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I spent countless weekends camping, hiking, and exploring the dense, misty forests that surrounded my hometown. There's something about being in nature, far away from the noise and stress of the city, that just feels right to me. But after what happened last summer, I'm not so sure I'll ever go back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me and a few close friends, unwinding after a long week of work. We'd planned it for months, picking out the perfect spot in a secluded area of the woods, miles away from any signs of civilization. The idea was to disconnect completely, to get away from everything and just enjoy the peace and quiet. The drive out there was long but scenic. We wound through narrow, tree-lined roads, the dense forest on either side creating a tunnel of green that seemed to stretch on forever. As we got closer to our destination, the trees became taller, their branches interlocking overhead, casting the road into a perpetual twilight. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. We set up camp in a small clearing by a creek, the sound of the rushing water a soothing backdrop to our laughter and conversation. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. After setting up our tents and gathering firewood, we settled in for the night, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories around the campfire. It was the kind of evening I'd been looking forward to for weeks, simple, relaxing, and free of any worries. But as the night wore on, something shifted. It started with a feeling, a vague sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the isolation and the unfamiliar surroundings. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the fire burned lower and the shadows around us deepened. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I noticed that I wasn't the only one on edge. My friend Mike, who was usually the life of the party, had gone quiet, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. Even Stella, who prided herself on being fearless, seemed uneasy, her laughter more forced than usual. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Mike shook his head. "I don't know, man. Something just feels off." Stella nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like we're being watched or something." We all glanced around the clearing, but there was nothing there, just the flickering shadows cast by the fire and the dark silhouettes of the trees. Still, the feeling of being watched was palpable, an invisible weight pressing down on us from all sides. We tried to shake it off, convincing ourselves that it was just our imaginations running wild. After all, we were deep in the woods, far from any signs of human life. Of course, it would feel a little eerie. But as the night wore on, the feeling only intensified. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent our hearts racing, our eyes searching the darkness for something, anything that could explain the unease. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, hoping that some rest would help clear our heads. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rustling of the trees, and the faint gurgle of the creek. But beneath those familiar sounds, there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible noise that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against a hollow log. It seemed to be coming from just outside my tent, growing louder with each passing second. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the tapping suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, every muscle in my body tense, expecting something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was just the wind, or maybe a branch knocking against a tree. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I thought about waking up Mike or Stella, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. So I stayed in my tent, trying to force myself to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint tapping in the back of my mind, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. The next morning, we woke up to a fog that had rolled in overnight, blanketing the forest in a thick, white mist. The world outside our tents was completely obscured, the trees reduced to faint, ghostly silhouettes. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, but it only added to the unease that had settled over our camp. We decided to pack up and head out early, figuring we could stop for breakfast at a diner on the way back. But as we were breaking down the tents, Mike froze, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Stella and I followed his gaze, squinting through the mist. At first, I didn't see anything, just the usual shadows and trees. But then I noticed it, a dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the fog. It was a person, but something about them wasn't right. They were too still, too unnatural. It was as if they were just a shadow, a vague outline of a human shape without any real substance. "Hey!" Mike called out, his voice breaking the silence. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, watching us. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that this was what we had felt the night before, this presence watching us from the shadows. We quickly finished packing and started walking back to the car, our pace quickening with each step. But the figure didn't follow. It just stayed there, fading into the mist as we moved further away. We didn't say much on the drive back. The whole experience had left us shaken. and none of us wanted to talk about it. But a few days later, I decided to go back to the campsite on my own, hoping to find some explanation for what we had seen. When I arrived, the mist had cleared, and the forest looked normal again, peaceful even. But as I walked through the clearing, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of our camp, no fire pit, no flattened grass where our tents had been, nothing. It was as if we had never been there at all. But that wasn't the strangest part. As I approached the spot where we had seen the figure, I noticed something etched into the bark of a tree, a series of deep, jagged lines that formed a crude, unsettling symbol. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it sent a wave of dread through me, a primal fear that made me want to turn and run. I quickly backed away, my heart racing, and decided to leave the forest behind for good. Whatever we had encountered out there, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. It was better left alone, buried in the mist and shadows where it belonged. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure standing among the trees, but there was nothing there, or at least, nothing I could see. It's been months since that trip, but the memory of that figure in the mist still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about it, standing there, just watching. I wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of that rhythmic tapping echoing in my ears. I don't go camping anymore. I've convinced myself that it was just my imagination, that there's a rational explanation for everything that happened. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things are better left unexplained. Some things are better left forgotten. I've always been a vivid dreamer. Ever since I was a kid, my dreams felt more like memories than figments of my imagination. They were vivid, colorful, and often so realistic that I'd wake up confused about what was real and what wasn't. But there was one dream, a dream that changed everything for me. One that blurred the lines between reality and something far more unsettling. It was a chilly autumn evening when it happened. The kind of night where the air is crisp and clear, the sky a deep shade of indigo. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. After dinner, I curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The warmth and the soft, crackling sounds lulled me into a comfortable state of drowsiness, and before I knew it, I was dozing off. I found myself standing in the middle of a vast open field. The grass was tall and swayed gently in the wind, and the sky above was a mesmerizing swirl of colors, pinks, purples, and greens blending together in a surreal aurora. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful to be real, the kind of beauty that makes your heart ache. As I stood there, entranced by the colors, I noticed someone standing at the edge of the field. A woman, dressed in a long, flowing white gown that seemed to glow in the moonlight. She was standing still, her back to me, her long hair cascading down her back in dark waves. There was something ethereal about her, something that made me both drawn to her and afraid at the same time. I tried to call out to her to ask who she was, but my voice wouldn't work. The woman slowly turned her head, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her profile. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were a deep, haunting blue, filled with sadness and something else I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, the aurora in the sky intensified, the colors growing more vibrant, more chaotic. The wind picked up, howling through the field, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The woman raised her arm, pointing toward the horizon, where a dark, swirling cloud was forming, moving rapidly toward us. Panic surged through me, and I wanted to run, to escape whatever was coming, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The woman turned to face me fully now, and as our eyes met, I felt a strange connection, like she was trying to tell me something important, something urgent. But before I could make sense of it, the darkness engulfed us both, and I was jolted awake, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat up, disoriented, the remnants of the dream clinging to my mind like cobwebs. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. The tea on the table beside me had gone cold. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the lingering unease, but the image of the woman and the swirling aurora stayed with me. The next morning, I tried to put the dream out of my mind. I chalked it up to stress, maybe a reaction to something I'd eaten. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the woman's eyes, the sadness in them, or the way she had pointed toward the darkness. That evening after work, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I needed to shake off the feeling that had been gnawing at me all day. There's a park near my apartment, a place I often go when I need to think. It's a quiet place, with winding paths and tall trees that provide a sense of peace. As I walked, the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep, velvety blue. I found myself drawn to a small clearing in the park, a place where the trees parted to reveal a wide expanse of sky. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air, when I noticed something strange. The sky above me began to shimmer with the same colors I had seen in my dream. Pinks, purples, greens, swirling together in a mesmerizing dance. I blinked, convinced that I was imagining it, but the colors remained, growing more intense with each passing second. A sense of déjà vu washed over me, and I turned, half expecting to see the woman standing there, just like in my dream. But there was no one. The park was empty, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. A figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat as I squinted, trying to make out who it was. It was her. The woman from my dream, standing just beyond the trees, her white gown glowing faintly in the dim light. Panic gripped me as I took a step back, unsure of what to do. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me, her expression unreadable. I wanted to run, but something held me in place. Some inexplicable force that made me feel like I needed to stay, to understand what was happening. Then, slowly, the woman raised her arm again, just like in my dream, pointing to the sky. I followed her gaze, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The aurora above me had darkened, the colors shifting to deep, ominous shades of red and black. And within those swirling lights, I could see something moving. Something large and shadowy, like a storm cloud taking form. Fear surged through me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the wind whipping through the trees as the colors in the sky continued to churn. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. For days after that, I was plagued by the memory of the woman and the dark aurora. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep without seeing her face in my dreams. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that field, the darkness closing in around me. I tried to talk to someone about it, but how could I explain something like that without sounding crazy? Instead, I kept it to myself, hoping that it would eventually fade away. But it didn't. The dreams kept coming, more vivid and terrifying each time. Then one night, I woke up in a cold sweat, the memory of the latest dream still fresh in my mind. But this time, it wasn't just a dream. As I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard a faint noise, a tapping, coming from my window. I froze, my blood running cold. The tapping continued, soft but insistent, like someone was gently knocking on the glass. My apartment is on the 3rd floor, and there's no fire escape or balcony outside my window. There was no way anyone could be out there. But the tapping didn't stop. Summoning all my courage, I slowly got out of bed and approached the window. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, hesitating for just a moment before pulling it aside. There was nothing there, just the dark night sky and the faint glow of the city lights below. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned away from the window, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass. I whipped around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. But there was nothing there, just me, alone in my apartment. Or so I thought. That was the last time I ever saw the woman in my dreams, but the fear she left behind never truly went away. I moved to a different apartment, hoping that a change of scenery would help me forget. But every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of light, a shadow that moves when it shouldn't. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside, I hear that faint tapping on my window. I tell myself it's just the branches of a tree or the creaking of the building, but deep down, I know better. She's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And every time I look up at the night sky, I half expect to see those swirling colors again, the aurora that changed everything. Because some dreams don't fade with the morning light. Some dreams linger, waiting for the right moment to slip back into the darkness, to remind you that they're never truly gone. And neither is she. I've always had a fascination with old houses, especially those with a bit of history to them. I developed a habit of exploring abandoned places whenever I got the chance. It wasn't about the thrill of trespassing. It was more about the idea of connecting with the past, of uncovering forgotten secrets hidden behind layers of dust and decay. But there's one place I wish I'd never stepped foot in. A place that, to this day, sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. It was late fall, the kind of day where the sky is overcast and the air is thick with the smell of damp leaves. My best friend Ethan and I had been wandering through the outskirts of town, following a trail that led us deep into the woods. We'd heard rumors about an old farmhouse that had been abandoned for decades, a place that kids dared each other to visit but rarely did. The trail was overgrown, like the trees so dense that it felt like twilight even in the middle of the day. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally broke through the thicket and into a small clearing. And there it was, the farmhouse. It was everything I'd imagined and more. The house stood 3 stories tall, its once white paint peeling and faded, the windows cracked and covered in grime. The roof sagged in places, and the front porch looked like it would collapse if you so much as breathed on it. Vines had claimed the walls, winding their way up to the broken chimney. The whole place had an air of neglect, of something long forgotten by time. But what caught my eye the most was the cellar door. It was half buried under a pile of dead leaves, its wooden slats warped and rotting, the rusted iron latch barely holding it shut. Something about it made me uneasy, a nagging feeling that we shouldn't be here. But Ethan, ever the thrill seeker, was already making his way toward it. "Come on," he called back to me, grinning like a kid in a candy store. "Let's check it out." I hesitated, my gut telling me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. After all, how many chances would I get to explore a place like this? So, with a deep breath, I followed Ethan to the cellar door. It creaked ominously as we pried it open, the hinges protesting with a loud screech. A cold draft wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it the smell of mold and earth. We shined our flashlights into the gloom, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the unknown. "Ladies first," Ethan joked, nudging me toward the stairs. I rolled my eyes but stepped forward, carefully making my way down the steps. The wood groaned under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it might give way at any moment. But we made it to the bottom without incident, our flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. The cellar was surprisingly large, with low ceilings and rough stone walls that looked like they'd been carved out of the earth itself. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Old crates and rusted tools were scattered around, relics of a time long past. But there was something else down there, something that didn't belong. In the far corner of the cellar, half hidden in the shadows, was a door. It was out of place, newer than everything else, with clean edges and a sturdy frame. It didn't make sense. Who would build a door in an abandoned cellar, and why? "Check this out," Ethan said, his voice tinged with excitement as he walked over to it. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. As we got closer, I noticed that the door had no handle, no keyhole, nothing to indicate how it could be opened. It was just there. Ethan tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. What do you think's behind it?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should just leave it alone." But Ethan wasn't listening. He was already looking around for something to pry the door open with. He found an old crowbar among the debris and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. With a grunt, he pushed against it, and slowly the door began to open. As the door creaked open, a wave of cold air rushed out, so frigid that it felt like it was cutting through my skin. My breath hitched as I shined my flashlight into the darkness beyond. There was nothing there, just an empty void, as if the space behind the door didn't exist. "Ethan, I don't like this," I said, backing away. We should go. But Ethan was too absorbed in his discovery to notice my fear. Come on, we've come this far. Let's at least see what's inside. He stepped forward, his flashlight barely illuminating the darkness ahead. I hesitated for a moment before following him, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The void seemed to swallow the light, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of us. The air was thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that something was very, very wrong. And then we heard it. A soft, distant whisper, echoing from somewhere deep within the darkness. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. Ethan froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, too scared to speak. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, as if it was coming closer. It was a voice, but it wasn't speaking any language I could understand. It was garbled, twisted, like the words were being stretched and distorted. And it wasn't just one voice, it was many, all overlapping, creating a nightmarish cacophony. "Let's get out of here," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. Ethan didn't argue. We turned and ran back toward the cellar stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. But as we reached the bottom of the stairs, we realized something horrifying. The door was locked. Panic set in as we frantically searched for a way out, our flashlights sweeping across the walls. But there was nothing, no other door, no window, no escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the cellar with their maddening chorus. They seemed to be coming from all around us, surrounding us, closing in. And then, out of the darkness, we saw them. Figures, barely visible in the dim light, emerging from the shadows. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched taut over gaunt, skeletal frames. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to bore into our souls. They moved slowly, almost mechanically, their limbs jerking and twitching as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. The whispers grew louder as they approached, their mouths moving in unison, chanting in that same incomprehensible language. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror as the figures closed in on us. "Ethan, we have to do something," I urged, my voice rising in panic. "We have to get out of here!" But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the figures as they drew closer, their voices growing louder, more intense. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The figures froze in place, their hollow eyes fixed on us. The silence was deafening, oppressive, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. For a moment, I thought we might be safe. But then the ground beneath us began to tremble, a low rumble that grew stronger with each passing second. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him toward the far wall. We had nowhere to go, no escape, but we couldn't just stand there and wait for whatever was coming. The figures began to move again, faster this time, their movements more frantic, more desperate. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, filling the cellar with their maddening chant. And then we found a passage, a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the earth. Without thinking, we dove into it, the darkness swallowing us whole. We ran, not knowing where the tunnel led, not caring. All that mattered was putting as much distance between us and those things as possible. The whispers faded behind us, but the fear remained, driving us forward, deeper into the unknown. Eventually, the tunnel opened up into another chamber, a small, cramped space with rough stone walls and a low ceiling. We collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. For a moment, there was silence. No whispers, no figures, just the sound of our ragged breathing. But then we saw it. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights, was an old, rotting coffin. It was half buried in the dirt, the wood splintered and decayed. But there was something inside it. A figure, curled up in the fetal position, its skeletal hands clutching a worn, leather-bound book. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized what we had found, what we had disturbed. We had uncovered something that was never meant to be found, something ancient and malevolent. And now, it was awake. Ethan and I didn't say a word as we backed away from the coffin, our flashlights trembling in our hands. We knew there was no escape, no way out of the nightmare we had stumbled into, but we had to try. We turned and ran back the way we had come, our footsteps echoing through the narrow tunnel. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were chasing us, urging us to come back. But we didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't dare. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was lying in the clearing where we had first found the farmhouse. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the air was warm. There was no sign of the mist, the cellar, or the horrors we had encountered. Ethan was lying next to me, unconscious but alive. I shook him awake, and we stumbled back to the car, not saying a word, not looking back. We drove in silence, our minds reeling from the nightmare we had just escaped. But deep down, I knew we hadn't really escaped. Whatever we had unleashed was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next fool to stumble upon it. And one day, it would find us again. But until then, I can only wait and pray that the whispers never find their way back to me. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe for more terrifying tales. Share your own scary experiences in the comments below. Who knows, your story might be featured in our next video. Stay tuned, stay safe, and remember, the scariest things happen when you least expect them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next nightmare.